We are on the back end, almost completely done with our Mesopotamian region civilizations. We have really only talked about the first civilization in Mesopotamia, which was the Sumerians, and so we need to finish out the other five. So we need to talk about the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and the Persians. So there's five more that we need to talk about. The last video lecture series talked about the Sumerians and their inventions, which was the wheel, astronomy, mathematics. They were polytheistic, meaning that they believed in multiple gods. Really all six of the Mesopotamian civilizations are polytheistic, meaning that they believe in multiple gods. But we need to talk about the Akkadians today and just kind of review a little bit about the Mesopotamian region. Like I told you, they were polytheistic and they were constantly invaded. One invaded the other ones. You know, the Sumerians were invaded by the Akkadians by the Babylonians by the Assyrians by the Chaldean Babylonians, and then the Chaldeans were taken over by the Persians. And that's all because that Mesopotamian region, you know, the land between two rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, there's no natural protective barriers. There's no mountain ranges that make it tough to invade. It's just wide open, and so easy to attack, easy to invade, and that's why we see a changing of the guard, if you will, 6 times in the Mesopotamian region. The kings of each of these civilizations were very powerful. They were almost looked upon as gods, which makes them what's called a theocracy. A theocracy meaning that the kings are divine, almost godlike, so they were very, very powerful. And with the Akkadians, their king, their divine king, their theocratic ruler was a guy named Sargon, Sargon, and he was the first to rule and establish the Akkadians as what's called an empire. An empire is a huge, vast ruling territory, meaning that they expanded very big, a large territory under a single leader, which was the most popular was Sargon. The Babylonians took over the Akkadians. The Babylonians were very sophisticated. They were very cultural. They had a very definite center of trade area, and because they had so many people coming into this center of trade area in Babylon, there was tons of cultural diffusion, which we've already talked about, people learning other people's cultures, religions, trades, jewelry, behavior patterns, things like that. One of the most famous theocratic rulers, kings if you will, divine kings, was King Hammurabi. You guys have probably heard of King Hammurabi and Hammurabi's code. He lived by a very strict code that can best be defined as, and I bet you've heard of this before, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Meaning what you do to someone, you're going to get back in return. That was kind of his law and his disciplined way of life in the Babylonian Empire. Their economy was very strong. They were the first to establish a written form of laws. Unwritten forms of laws have been around since the beginning of mankind. We have unwritten laws at our house, make up your bed, keep your room clean, but they're not written. They're the first, King Hammurabi and the Babylonians are the first to have a literally written down code of conduct, if you will, which were laws. They were placed where everybody can see them, so they were placed at the center of Babylon for all to see, and everybody had to follow, those laws. King Hammurabi and Hammurabi's code was basically about retaliation. If you do this to somebody, this is going to happen to you. And it was a strict, but at the same time, it was protection for the people that lived in Babylon. So if you mess around and hurt someone or steal from someone or take from someone, there's a severe consequence. There's a severe penalty that comes with that. And it's written. And then they're the first. That's a very important thing to remember. They're the first to have like a written code. The Babylonian Empire lasted for about 3 centuries until they were taken over by the Assyrians, the Lion Kings of Assyria, if you will. The army of Assyria is known for its kings. They were very famous. King Sennacherib was one of the most powerful Assyrian rulers. They were, I'm not going to say the word, but the Assyrians, the first three letters of the word Assyria or the Assyrians, the first three letters, ASS, kind of describe how the Assyrians were. They were mean. They were bad people, man. They got after it, and they were very violent, took over the Babylonians, burned down Babylon, completely burned down their history, burnt down everything, killed most of the people that were in the city. One of their kings, Ashurbanipal, was known to go in and sack the city and basically cut off all the body parts of the people of Babylon, like completely dismembered them, and laid siege and took over Babylon. When they took over and they built up, the Assyrian Empire and the Assyrian civilization, they had great art. They built huge palaces that were very extravagant and expensive. The Assyrians were the first to establish a library, and we all know what libraries are for. The libraries are to keep records. So the Assyrians were very important about preserving their history in what's called a library. It was the library at Nineveh. Nineveh is a city in the Assyrian Empire. They were one of the first to start a postal system where you could deliver mail and messages across the whole Assyrian Empire and relay basically text messaging, if you will, like we would text message today. They were eventually taken over by the Chaldeans, the Chaldean Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar, which is mentioned in the Bible. But when King Nebuchadnezzar and the Chaldean Babylonians took over the Assyrians, King Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon because you got to remember the Assyrians burnt down Babylon. He established one of the 7 wonders of the world. He made a hanging gardens. It's literally called the Hanging Gardens. It's one of the 7 wonders of the world. At the time, it was just beautiful. It was a multi-level building. Each level had these gardens that kind of hung over the side of the building. There'll be a picture that I'll give you in this presentation that kind of shows you that. They built the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate was the entrance into the Chaldean Babylonian Empire. It was beautiful. It had a huge ark at the top dedicated to the goddess Ishtar. It was basically the inner gate to get into Babylon, the new Chaldean Babylonian Empire after the Assyrian Empire. Eventually, though, Nebuchadnezzar, he falls around 597 BC. The people of Babylon were taken captive. It was called the Babylonian captivity, and mainly they were Jewish. They were enslaved, and they remained enslaved for about 61 years, I believe. After they were taken over by the Persians, the Chaldean Babylonians were taken over by the Persians. The Persians were a military might. Like they were very good at what they did militarily speaking. Had a great amount of military success. Took over the Mesopotamian region. Became the sixth civilization in Mesopotamia after taking over that region. Their wealth was huge, tons of wealth. They had a highway system built. Today we have highways for cars. Now they didn't have cars back then, but they had travel routes that connected each city within the Persian Empire. So you have great cultural diversity, multicultural empire, lots of diversity in their empire. They actually encouraged diversity, which the prior 5 empires really didn't do. In fact, if you brought in something new, a new idea, a new thought, you were usually killed for it. But not with the Persians. The Persians were pretty tolerant rulers. Cyrus the Great is one of the more famous Persian emperors that led, Persian kings that led in Persia, which would be today, present-day Iran. If you looked on a map, it would be the area of Iran. He actually set the Jews free. Remember I told you that the Chaldean Babylonians were captured, and the Jews, which lived in that empire, in that civilization, were taken captive. He freed them. Cyrus did. Created a very, very strong empire in Persia. Of course, the Persian kings had absolute power. Like I told you, the whole empire was very diverse because it was very connected through the highway system that he built. The Persians were basically divided the whole civilization of Persia into about 20 different, I guess you could call them counties, like we call them counties today. Back then they called them, I think, satraps or provinces. They collected taxes from their citizens, so their citizens had to pay taxes just like we do today. One of the Persian kings, Darius, had a very, very strong horseback military, meaning the soldiers rode on horseback. We call that cavalry. They were very elite infantry of 10,000 men. And that group of cavalry under Darius were called the Immortals. He kept a very strong group of immortals, 10,000 strong. It never dropped below 10,000 horseback infantrymen. So their religion was polytheistic. There is one that popped up called Zoroastrianism, which that one was actually monotheistic. Remember, monotheistic means they only believed in one God. But there were quite a few gods that popped up through the Persian Empire. Eventually, though, the Persians will go down in history. They will fall to Alexander the Great. 330 BC, Alexander the Great takes over the Persian Empire, and Alexander the Great will go down, as one of the greater conquerors of the world. But that kind of takes you through the remaining 5 civilizations of Mesopotamia. So we covered all of them. We covered Sumer, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Chaldean Babylonians, who eventually fell to the Persians. And then that kind of ends this unit over Mesopotamia in that area in Iraq and Syria and even Iran with the Persians. And so that'll conclude Mesopotamia. So we'll move on. The next area that we'll study in the world that starts popping up and flourishing is Egypt. So that's next up.